Hello, everyone. Today, your coaches Olivia and Sarah will be talking about the policy debate topic. This is Able to Shine's second part of a topic lecture series. These videos are designed to give you an in-depth background knowledge on the topic this year. The expectation is for you to watch this video while taking notes, and you should feel free to pause at any time. But we really want you to use this video to help you determine which affirmative to read and be prepared on the negative to engage a variety of different topics. The plan is, first, we're going to go through some background information on the topic, go over topicality as it pertains to the resolution, go over each of the three core topic areas, and then talk a little bit more about core negative ground. So the topic this year is as follows: resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase its security cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in one or more of the following areas: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and cybersecurity. We went ahead and bolded the kind of words that are key that we're going to be focusing on in this topic lecture. So in this case, AI, biotech, and cybersecurities are areas that the affirmatives can make plans and advantages about. And some of these will be intertwined, like AI might have implications for things like cybersecurity, but a brief overview on what each are, and we'll talk more about it in a little bit. But AI affirmatives would talk about things like decision-making, planning, execution, communications. Biotech would cover things like vaccine development and distribution, biological weapons, and biological materials. And cybersecurity might refer to securing cyber tech at a domestic, international, or military level, which also might have implications for electrical grids and economies. The topic ultimately asks you to consider two primary pieces. First is emerging threats and technologies. You might also hear this as disruptive technologies. But this question is ultimately what type of emerging technologies will there be? Or you'll also hear this referenced as disruptive technologies, and that's a question of what sorts of areas need to be addressed, and that will fall under one of the three core areas. The second question and phrase you should consider is security cooperation. We should be asking ourselves, how can the US contribute and cooperate with NATO? The affirmative needs to have a very clear answer to this question to avoid things like advantage counterplans.
So when it comes to topicality, there's going to be one very, very large debate, and it's going to be on the phrase security cooperation. Now, there's going to be two main ways of thinking about this. You're either going to see security cooperation as a term of art, or security cooperation almost like a suggestion. When it comes to being a term of art, the Department of Defense specifically uses the term security cooperation to mean something tangible when it comes to its policy initiatives. It actually has a really long list of what it considers security cooperation and what actions meet that term and that standard. Kind of a brief outline of what they mean by that is the DoD would have to engage in activities that involve the transfer of defense articles and services, military to military exercises, military education, training and advising, and capacity building of partner security forces. And they're looking to achieve key objectives and make advancements. Now, this is going to be a little restricting on affirmatives because it means a lot of the things that Olivia and I might talk about when we explore the three areas are not going to be topical. And so it really is going to be helping negative debaters when it comes to interpreting this phrase this way. And it's really going to kind of militarize the whole debate. Now, on the other hand, there seems to be kind of the opposite, that we are focusing more on the cooperation part with NATO to achieve some kind of vaguely security-minded goal. We don't have to include the Department of Defense, and we don't have to have military goals or objectives, which means we can focus on other impacts like green tech, health, infrastructure, and other more less intensive parts of the three categories, but this also explodes affirmative ground. It's going to mean that there's a lot more AFs that negs are going to have to prep for and be prepared to answer, and they're going to have to be able to answer both sides. So you might have a case where, oh, I don't know, maybe AI, we want to make AI advancements with operational cyber offensives, and we want to pursue those, or maybe we want to ban those. So it's really going to put the neg in a tricky spot. Now, the problem with these two sides is the community seems to be split. The framers' intent seems to be on the security cooperation as a suggestive phrase, but a lot of the more serious camps seem to have interpreted it as a term of art. So a lot of the evidence that you see coming out are going to treat it as the term of art rather than how the topic paper handled the phrase and how the NSDA is handling this. So it's going to be something I think we're going to be working out throughout the season, and you really just have to make the decision of how you want to debate this topic and if you want to pursue this through topicality as a strategy or not.
All right, so a little bit of background on the topic. Another word or phrase in the resolution is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It might also be referred to as the North Atlantic Alliance. But this is basically an intergovernmental military alliance between 30 member states. 28 are European and 2 are North American. NATO was established in the aftermath of World War II. And the organization implemented the North Atlantic Treaty, which was signed in Washington in 1949. And what NATO is primarily is a system of collective security. And so what that means is that its independent member states agree to defend each other against attacks from third parties. So during the Cold War, NATO operated as a check on the perceived threats posed by the Soviet Union. And the alliance remained in place after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and has been in military operations in the Balkans, the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. So they're pretty widespread. A commonly discussed part of NATO is the Article 5 commitment, which again, because they're a collective security agreement, says if you attack one NATO country, the allies will view it as an attack on themselves and respond accordingly. The September 11th attacks in the United States caused NATO to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter for the first time in the organization's history. Another time you might have been hearing it discussed is the current situation in Russia right now. Even though Ukraine was not exclusively a member state, it did correspond with NATO and has been wanting to be a member state. So Article 5 has been discussed extensively in that regard, and will have some implications for disadvantages about NATO, NATO cohesion, NATO responsiveness, NATO collectiveness, etc. Because this is an international topic, there are some terms you should familiarize yourself with. You're going to be hearing realism discussed, which is an international relations term that refers to the idea that state actors operate according to a rational choice theory. Or in other words, states are rational actors that seek to maximize security and self-interest. And because of that, there's not a lot of cooperation between states, which is what perceives them and moves them towards conflict. Another word you might hear is hegemony, and this just refers to leadership. Often in debates, it's contextual to US leadership or US influence. How this might come up is an affirmative might use this word or might want to improve or develop a technology that is advantage area maintained US hegemony to prevent things like changes in spheres of influence, which might cause conflict. Another word is constructivism. It's another theory in IR that would say social relations construct the way that we are. So having international organizations, especially NATO, and having norms and rules are important to guide international relations and avoid things like anarchy. So constructivism is very like rule heavy, norm heavy, etc. And the last word is economy, which you definitely should be familiar with, but I want to emphasize that the economy in international relations is very interconnected through things like supply chains, trade, and commerce. So you're going to see affirmatives and disadvantages talking about that explicitly. Most affirmatives are going to be dealing with one of the 4 major controversies in some form or fashion. The first thing affirmatives and negatives will be talking about is the security dilemma. This refers to a situation where one state increases the security, other states feel threatened by that increase and also increase their security. As a result, it results in less security for everyone involved. And because there's like this race for security development, you risk escalation and conflict. A concrete example of this was the arms race during the Cold War between the US and the USSR. Each state felt threatened by the weapons on the opposing sides, so they kept building up their military strength to try and outcompete one another. Next, affirmatives will often be saying liberalism is good, and negative will be critiquing models of liberalism. Liberalism emphasizes the role of institutions intervening in social and political affairs and mediating economic, financial, and cultural needs. So the theory would hold that states can cooperate and work together, which again is fundamentally different than realism, which says states aren't cooperative and states are seeking to maximize self-interest. And so you should just think liberalism is definitely about models of cooperation, and you can think of that as it parallels the NATO alliance. Affirmatives will also be discussing ethical and legal restrictions, particularly in the context of AI. And lastly, affirmatives will have broad economic advantages because of the potential emerging developing technologies or EDTs have for the economy. So as Sarah discussed about kind of security cooperation, each of the affirmatives will have to have an answer to it. And there's a few ways or places that this could look like. Cooperation could look like information sharing or diplomacy, and that could be like vaccine diplomacy via the distribution of vaccines if it was a biotech affirmative. It could take the forms of treaties via international regulation. It might look like a PPP, which is a public-private partnership, and those are often good for things like innovation. So you might see a negative counterplan doing PPPs for AI. In applications, it could look like limiting the applications of EDTs. It could also look like hardening and protecting ourselves from emerging disruptive technologies. And then it could deal with a declaratory policy where NATO makes a commitment to do something in a particular context.
All right, let's talk about artificial intelligence. This is the first of our 3 categories that we can explore with this resolution. Before I get into the types of affirmatives that you're probably going to see with the artificial intelligence section, let's talk a little bit about what artificial intelligence is. Now, we're all sort of vaguely familiar with artificial intelligence, whether it's using chatbots on the internet or even asking Siri to tell us a bedtime story. We interact more and more with AI year after year after year, and it's becoming an increasingly important part of our everyday lives. But there's a lot of issues with AI, and it's very much still a future-based technology, especially when it comes to military and security implications, because AI is technically and basically learning software. We teach a program how to identify things, how to sort, how to do algorithmic calculations. And so in order for AI to be successful, it needs to be taught, and it's taught through data sets. And usually these data sets are thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures or words or scenarios that it has to be fed by a human who has to then teach it how to interpret that data set. Computers are very literal. So it has problems interpreting our more human aspects. So things like sarcasm, memes, jokes, or even our grammar inaccuracies. It struggles with those kinds of things. AI also struggles with differentiating between items that it's been trained to recognize and those it has no learning with. So if AI is taught to recognize a certain type of Chinese tank, it will have problems recognizing a Russian tank that looks slightly different because it was not taught to recognize those kind of nuanced differences. Whereas a human could see that's a tank. The problem with humans are they're still slower to react. So if you taught an AI how to recognize a Chinese tank, you could then have an AI program right after it that was taught to target that tank, and then another program that was taught to send a missile at that tank. And those calculations would be much, much quicker than it would take, or in theory would be much quicker than it would take a human to recognize a tank, target it manually, and then launch a missile at it manually, or contact someone to destroy that tank. So AI has the potential to be much, much quicker to react than humans are. So let's get into the different affirmatives you might see. The first is ethical AI. Now, the problem with evolving AI is, while it has a lot of pros, it also has a lot of cons. Artificial intelligence can be used to discriminate against certain people. We see that a lot in Jod Place artificial intelligence, where it's racist or does not recognize certain genders or races or LGBTQ folks. It can also be used to unfairly target certain kinds of people or places. So NATO came together several years ago to create 6 different principles to kind of guide themselves into making ethical AI. And those 6 principles are lawfulness. The AI has to follow the rule of law, responsibility and accountability. The AI must be taken accountability for by the humans that are using it, explainability and traceability. So the humans involved have to be able to explain the processes and the actions taken and be able to trace them to be held accountable. Reliability, the tech has to work, and it has to work in such a way that it can be predictable in its working and in its behavior. Governability, it has to be able to be stopped if it needs to be. It needs to be able to be controlled still by humans, so humans can have like an emergency stop switch. And bias mitigation, so it needs to be developed in such a way that it is unbiased towards certain groups of people, civilians, things like that. The other thing you might want to talk about with ethical AI is how to enforce ethical AI standards. It's one thing to enforce them within NATO, it's another to enforce them globally with bad faith actors who will take this tech to hurt people or to take advantage of people financially or in other means. The next affirmative that you'll probably see a lot of is lethal autonomous weapons. Killer robots is essentially what this part of the topic is talking about. It's unmanned robots or guided missile systems that use artificial intelligence to conduct whatever task they've been assigned. It's not just shooting down drones or planes or ships. It can also be search and rescue missions. So the specific benefit of lethal autonomous weapons or semi-autonomous weapons is it takes the human element out of it, which means your ground troops are in far less danger because they can remotely send out these weapons and are actually in the battleground themselves. So a really common lethal autonomous weapon is a short-range ballistic missile. You can be thousands of kilometers away and still hit your target. Also, the direct targeting of individuals. Russia showed in 2014 that it had the capability to directly target, I think it was a Ukrainian military commander, and they were able to pinpoint him and kill him with a lethal autonomous weapon. So this technology exists, it's actively being used, and it has its own problems, but there's a lot of good evidence against it. This was actually a Lincoln Douglas debate topic, believe last year at some point. So there's a lot of cards and out there for you if this is something you're interested in. The next stuff is OCOs, or offensive cyber operations. Offensive cyber operations is basically using cyber attacks to take out critical infrastructure, manipulate data, hijack important accounts. So maybe maybe like a high-ranking government officials, access to whatever national databases that they have, and it's usually to try to get information or to sometimes blackmail countries into paying a sum of money in order to prevent the attackers from not disabling infrastructure. OCOs could also be retaliatory. So if Russia takes out the cyber grid of Lithuania, NATO could retaliate and take out the cyber grid of Russia. And so it kind of leads to a back and forth. It's less intense, obviously, than nuclear attacks, but of course, OCOs could definitely go nuclear. If you knock out the electrical grid in Russia in the middle of winter, they're definitely going to have a strong retaliation for the suffering that its people will endure. And then the last AI case that I found that I wanted to talk to y'all about was satellite communications. So there's a lot of research and development happening with satellites and artificial intelligence right now, because AI is really good at processing a lot of data really, really quickly. And so when satellites are pointed down at Earth and are collecting a lot of data about the movement of different targets, or even the topography of an area, and trying to see what the ground conditions are like, it can take all of that data, analyze it really quickly, and then send it to the people that need that information. AI can also increase the functionality of satellites. It can help them get clearer pictures or collect more data. It can also fix interference. AI can actually stop hacking attacks on satellites to help protect them. And also AI can be programmed to know when to send intelligence and know where to send it. So if certain intelligence needs to go to certain command centers, it can through an algorithm figure out where to send everything. This tech is all very important for commanding military operations and to prevent like miscalculations and misfiring, and especially to prevent friendly fires. So all of these, AI is a great tool, and all of these different apps really have the one thing in mind: we want to collect data to be able to advance ourselves strategically. Some of them are more aggressive than the others, but AI's main purpose is to collect data to help make better decisions.
All right, so the next area is biotechnology. Biotechnology is a super broad part of the topic because it refers to any form of technology that utilizes biological systems. So affirmatives could research, develop, or place restrictions on biotechnology. Remember, the topic does not specify the direction. So you could say biotech is good or biotech is bad and place regulations. So this might be tech so you might want to place restrictions on tech that specifically manipulates living cells or organisms. You might want to research tech or biotech that innovates new products or tries to improve defense capabilities of the US and NATO. I also am going to go through a series of affirmatives that could potentially be read. The first is the NSDA packet affirmative that deals with human genetic germline engineering. You should definitely be familiar with this one because it's the NSDA packet. People will be reading variations of this. Affirmatives in this area could ban, increase regulations, or increase research into human genetic germline technology. And what this is germline basically edits the genes, and that editing of genes affects the offspring. So affirmatives could say that we should increase research into germline technology to edit genes to make super soldiers, right? Soldiers that can stay up really late so they can man ships longer, that they have super strength, all sorts of things like that. Affirmatives that want to ban or regulate germline are going to say that it goes too far and it could be eugenics. So I could see some soft left affirmatives saying that we should regulate it or we should ban it because you might edit in genes in a way that eradicates queer or disabled populations. And that regulation might be restrict germline technology to only disease eradication, et cetera, which is arguably still eugenic, but things like that. The next topic is biofuels, which I'm personally excited about. Affirmatives might say we should increase research and development into biofuels. It might also set a standard for NATO biofuel usage, which would be the cooperation part of the AF. What this would essentially be doing is researching how to take naturally grown substances, corn for instance, and using different biological processes to turn it into fuel. The advantage areas might say something along the lines that the DoD is a big polluter and we need to reduce their impact on the environment. Another might say that because of Russia sanctions, it's critical at this point to reduce our dependence on oils, et cetera, and switch to biofuels. So that would be kind of a uniqueness play that the affirmative could make with the Russia scenario. The next kind of category of affirmatives are bioterrorism defense. So if anything, the COVID-19 outbreak has illustrated how unprepared we are for any form of disease outbreaks. So bioweapons and bioterrorisms are definitely big threats to country. And there's a lot of articles that are pretty recent about why that is. And a bioweapon is any weapon that uses microorganisms, or in other words, uses disease as weapons. And affirmatives might say we should regulate research to mitigate the risk of bioterrorism. We should ban the militarization of bioweapons, or we should even do things like stockpile drugs for emergency preparedness or invest in threat detection infrastructure. The next affirmative, which I mentioned briefly, is things like vaccine diplomacy. And these affirmatives would increase funding or create a framework for research, stockpile vaccines, or streamline the distribution process. So this is also kind of a timeliness issue. So during COVID-19, China and Russia filled the vaccine vacuum, which was left by the West. So there are a lot of articles about how the West needs to catch up and use vaccine diplomacy to rebuild those relations with other countries. The last big section of affirmatives are going to deal with climate change. So these affirmatives are going to fund research or promote innovation that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. That might look like developing bugs or microorbs to mine rare earth minerals more efficiently, use alternatively sourced plastics, carbon capture trees, or chemical productions. Another form of this might be agricultural biotech, which talks about researching disease resistance, talking about growing food faster or reducing food waste. And the uniqueness play they're going to spin on this is that world hunger is on the rise because of the Ukrainian conflict, and also agriculture is the #1 cause of climate change. So you're going to have some pretty strong internal links to climate change impacts.
All right, and then we have cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is really just protecting critical infrastructure, websites, voting booths, banks, what we use in our day-to-day lives that's connected to the internet, and protecting those critical pieces of infrastructure from attacks being shut down. And there's several different ways that we can go about this. And so we have lots of affirmatives in cybersecurity that are maybe a little smaller, but kind of sound the same. So the first we're going to talk about is information sharing. It's really hard to pinpoint or attribute who does the cybersecurity attacks. against different countries and their infrastructure. So by working together with other countries, like all the countries in NATO, we can triangulate better track down those who commit these attacks. And so we can prove if it was just like some rogue hackers or if it was actually a government sponsored attack. So what happens usually in the status quo is the United States will be able to recognize, let's say, an attack coming from Russia, but it can't tell if it was just rogue Russian hackers or if it was a Russian government sponsored attack. So by information sharing between other countries, we can work together to actually pinpoint who actually is committing these attacks, which means we can place sanctions on these countries, we can confront them, engage with them, and try to get them to stop, or we can just retaliate. So whatever flavor you want to go for, if you want to go more diplomacy or hard power, carry a big stick, kind of impacts, up to you. In the same vein is assisted development. So this is very much in line with the resolution and sounds very topical, which we love. And it's basically assisting the other members of NATO to increase protections and help defend their own infrastructure against cyber attacks. This was a big point last year in public forum with the Baltic states topic. We talked a lot about protecting Baltic infrastructure from Russian hackers or Russian government cyber attacks. And I think it's a really good place to specifically highlight the cooperation point of the resolution. Infrastructure protections, so you can specifically talk about grid defense, banking, internet, voting machines. I think you could even go as far as talk about like automatic bridges or the port systems, any kind of infrastructure that relies on electricity or the internet systems to run itself, I think is fair game. I would say even military defense systems, missile systems are all up for debate with infrastructure protection. So lots of room. And then we have 5G. So 5G is a little bit different flavor here. So the 5G systems infrastructure that's been built up and put in place was built very, very quickly, which means it didn't really get a lot of safety redundancies and precautions built in, which means it's very vulnerable. It leaves backdoors open, and it's a method in which hackers can more easily access our internet, critical infrastructure, databases, government websites, government agency portals, things of that nature. It also has the additional benefit of decreasing the Chinese hegemony. China has really been the pushing force behind 5G, and so you get the advantage of pushing China a little bit out of the market and taking away some of the benefits that they've been getting from being dominant in the 5G industry. And then the last affirmative I want to talk about in cybersecurity is space-based strategic assets. And those are basically satellites. It sounds a little fancy, but they're essentially just satellites, but we use satellites for so many different things. We use satellites to help us with transportation, with weather pattern analysis. We use it for military operations, for airlines, airplanes, both commercial and military. And also we use satellite sensors for missile defense systems. So if any of these satellites go down, it leaves the United States and its allies, specifically just us, more than the rest, in a very vulnerable position, and can leave us open to attacks. It can leave our allies open to attacks, and it definitely takes away a lot of our information gathering abilities, which puts us on the back foot and would allow countries like Russia to make further pushes into Ukraine and even countries beyond and we would be much less prepared to deal with those military fronts. So much like AI and cybersecurity are very much tied together, but there are specific parts of cybersecurity that I think stand out and stand apart. Not everything involving security has to do with artificial intelligence. Sometimes you just have good old fashioned hackers who just want to cause trouble and watch the world burn. And this part of the resolution is specifically trying to prevent that. And I think it has some, if you're really into technology and the specifics of hacking and the internet, I think this is a really good method to go for an affirmative. I think you have not a lot of room here, but it's very specific, and I think the impacts are extremely strong. Now we're on to core negative strategies. So first we have disadvantages. There are a lot of, I think, more generic disadvantages that can be read on this topic than you might initially think. So the first disadvantage is just China. You can run a NATO needs to counter or deter China DA. So instead of putting all of your eggs into the basket of trying to do some security cooperation, we need to be focusing on hard countering China. And it is essentially a trade-off. We have limited resources, NATO has a limited budget, and so we can't be just putting all of our focus onto increasing AI or increasing biotech research when we need to be looking at what China is doing and make sure that we're not making the mistake with them that we made with Russia. So with Russia, NATO kind of did a wait and see kind of tactic, and it has kind of backfired, and it has allowed Russia to rise up and assert itself and take liberties and make aggressive moves that have put NATO in a rough spot. These DAs say that we cannot take that liberty with China. We need to be prepared and proactive in hard checking China. The next is one of my personal favorite kinds of disadvantages, which is the politics disadvantage. So there's a lot of different politics scenarios that are floating around right now. I put down a couple that are in the Open Evidence Project. One is about drug reform. One is about the China Competitiveness Act. And essentially, it's just right now, it looks like these bills are going to pass. The plan creates a toxic political environment that does not allow them to pass, and that's going to create a lot of bad impacts. These are going to be kind of pushed to the wayside due to the midterms happening. Most teams that run these kinds of arguments are going to probably be focusing more on midterms. But once the election is over, whatever party is more in control of the House and Senate is going to have a political agenda, push forward their legislation. So there's going to be new political decides to consider post-November election. Speaking of midterms disadvantages. So there's two types of midterm disadvantages that I'm seeing. GOP good and GOP bad. GOP good basically says right now it looks like the Republicans are going to be winning back seats and taking out the Democratic majority. This is good because GOP is good for military spending and hard lines of defense, but the plan is going to sour voters against the GOP. The Democrats are going to maintain their majority in the House and maybe even gain full majority in the Senate, and it's going to create bad impacts. And then the opposite, right now, the Democrats are set to sweep the House and gain majority in the Senate. Plan is going to turn the voters against the Democrats, and the GOP is going to win back the House and gain full majority in the Senate. This is going to create a lot of really bad impacts. I would say that if you wanted to talk about healthcare, The GOP is always looking to axe healthcare. I think you could specifically talk about women's reproductive rights on this with this kind of disadvantage. If GOP sweep the House and Senate, you can assure yourself that they're going to push forward an abortion ban bill. So if you wanted to talk about that, if that is an issue you're passionate about, this would be a good place to do that. The next far less contentious disadvantage is the Department of Defense. And it's just the Department of Defense is a government agency, so it's plagued by bureaucracy, an approval process, budget issues. It needs approval from Congress a lot of times for projects, so it's going to delay your solvency on the affirmative, and it's going to create a lot of red tape that's going to be hard and difficult to navigate. Usually the Department of Defense does not work directly with NATO, and it's just going to be a lot of weird wires crossed that's going to create a lot of inefficiency in the affirmative plan. So I would say if the affirmative is making a hard case for security cooperation is through the Department of Defense, just run Department of Defense bad. The next type of disadvantage you can run is arms race. There's lots of different types here. Artificial intelligence race, lethal autonomous weapons arms race, a hacking race, infrastructure attack, backlash, anything that you could think of that is more aggressive in nature. If we do it to a country, guaranteed they're going to try to do it back to us and our allies. So there's just lots of room for escalation and big impacts, nuclear war, biological warfare. The next disadvantage is NATO bad. It's kind of funny to talk about, but something we haven't discussed when it comes to NATO is NATO is an organization that kind of hinges on cohesion and cooperation. And the biggest perpetrator of being the I don't think so, no, I disagree is Turkey. Turkey is always causing problems in NATO. They work a lot with Russia, and Russia convinces Turkey to kind of put a shoehorn in a lot of the projects and the policies that the United States especially would like to see NATO push forward. There's always a lot of Turkey appeasement going on. There's always a lot of Turkey asserting itself and disagreeing with the majority. So you can have every other country in NATO agree on something, but when Turkey says no, it's essentially a veto. And it's almost the same with Greece, only because Turkey and Greece fight a lot. And that's also causing a lot of tension in NATO all of the time. Turkey and Greece have a land dispute over, I believe, the island of Cyprus. And so they're constantly going back and forth against each other. Greece pulls in France, Turkey gets mad. It's a lot of drama. And so NATO bad DAs are specifically going to highlight the inefficiencies of NATO and point out that it's not the most efficient organization to work through. And it's almost better to preserve the general cohesion of the status quo than try to push forward an act that's going to create chaos within NATO, especially in such a critical time as NATO needs to be supporting Ukraine as it is still at war with Russia, creating issues within that organization is going to put Ukraine in a really rough spot as well. So it's almost better to not. And then, of course, Russia. Doing anything with NATO is automatically going to trigger Russian aggression and backlash. NATO was basically created to be a check against Russian power, Russian expansion. A lot of former Soviet states have clung on to NATO for protection, so they are not annexed, attacked, invaded, though Russia still does try and definitely pushes against the line quite a lot, and it has now invaded Ukraine. So anything done with NATO automatically Russia DA. And then next we have counterplans. So there's a lot of counterplans here that specifically complement the disadvantages that we just talked about. As Olivia mentioned earlier, one of the best ways to get counterplan ground is to just do an advantage counterplan. And there's so much room for advantage counterplans on this topic. There's so many different artificial intelligence agencies and organizations that have done amazing research into AI that it would almost always be better to work with them rather than NATO on making AI advancements. It almost seems silly when you think about it. So if you want to have a discussion about actually advancing artificial intelligence capabilities, I would absolutely go with an advantage counterplan, because guaranteed there is some kind of science, technology organization or institute out there that is already doing it and doing it better. Or you can just go hard for the United States, does it alone, spends its own money, and does AI better. We got to remember that the United States fronts a lot of the bill for NATO projects, so it almost makes sense to do things on our own. And then we could also just, without working with NATO, counter Russia and China. There's no Russia-China aggression because we're not working through NATO. So you're always going to be able to counter any kind of issues with Russia and China through your advantage counterplans. There's also a lot of room for biotech counterplans, advantage counterplans here, because again, so many different biotech companies have made wonderful strides into research and development. Also, the United States military just does a lot of research and development into biotech on its own, trying to find alternative ways of getting fuel, resources, preparedness for disasters. There's just a lot to work with here. The next counterplan is going to be working through the Department of State versus the Department of Defense. So this kind of goes back to our security cooperation topicality point. This is essentially, we're going to do the plan, but do it as a security assistance and not a security cooperation. This essentially means that we're going to do the plan, but just do it in a less aggressive, less militarized way. This Department of State is more used to working with foreign countries rather than the Department of Defense, which really isn't. And it just is going to be a smoother and calmer operation than is going to be doing the plan through the Department of Defense. There's going to be a lot of benefits, less aggression from the United States is going to signal to Russia and China that they don't need to be concerned. This is not a military project. This is just a assistance project, and it isn't something that they need to kind of raise their hackles at. The next popular counterplan is going to be the EU counterplan. So the European Union, which has many, many, many more countries in it than NATO, is going to supercharge whatever impacts that the affirmative has. And you have a couple options of how you can go about this. The European Union can just do the plan on their own. The European Union can work with NATO, or the European Union can work with the United States. All of those are going to have slightly different cards, slightly different impacts, slightly different, different research, and it's going to be kind of specific to whatever affirmative that you're going to be running this counterplan against. But I think all of them are a good option. And again, when you have more countries working together, when it comes to research and development, you have more money, you have more resources, you have more scientists that can pull together to advance all of these projects much more quickly, and they can be used by more countries. More countries have access. That means you have more protections, or the technology gets widespread more quickly, which supercharges the impacts and the benefits again. Yeah, so really beneficial to, I think, do the EU counterplan. Going to NATO bad is NATO withdrawal counterplan. So that is essentially the United States is going to pull out of NATO because NATO is bad. I've seen this a couple of different ways. One is just NATO is dead weight. We need to cut them off and just kind of go solo. They're not serving the purpose that they were supposed to be, and we're kind of running the show. And carrying everyone across the line anyways, might as well cut our losses and just do our own thing. Or I've seen we need to check out of NATO because we need to align ourselves with either Russia or China, because that's how we're going to move forward with better cooperation with countries that are more equal to us in status on the world stage. If we work together with a country like China or Russia, we can achieve our goals much more quickly and on a much bigger scale because they have more power, more resources, and bigger budgets, and would be able to kind of more equally match us in terms of contribution. Also, it has the additional benefit of it's going to decrease and solve Russian or China aggression, because if we pull out of NATO, China and Russia are going to get what they've always wanted, which is a weaker Europe and United States with less allies in their back pocket. So maybe not the smartest move, but it's an interesting take if you're looking for something a little more unique. And in that same vein, the unilateral counterplan, which is the United States just does the plan on its own. It is a strong, independent country, and it does not need NATO to help it. And as we talked about earlier, with Turkey being the drama and doing the most, the Turkey pick. The Turkey pick will be a very interesting counterplan because it evades all of the issues that Turkey is going to bring to the table. And the counterplan is essentially do the plan with every country in NATO except for Turkey. Turkey doesn't get invited to the cool kids table, but that's what they get for being the drama. And then something that I found in my research that I thought was particularly interesting is the South Korea counterplan. I didn't see this anywhere in that anyone else was doing this, but South Korea and the Department of Defense already work together with AI advancements in the military. And so it might be interesting to, instead of working with NATO to advance AI, to work with South Korea. South Korea is amazingly advanced technologically speaking. They do a lot of work with artificial intelligence as it is. They are a close military ally to the United States. It would help with China, it would help with North Korea, and it would just further solidify our alliance with them to work with them on a project like whatever the AF is doing. So I think a South Korea counterplan could be kind of cool. You could also just have South Korea work with NATO and the United States, but I think just US South Korea would be a really fun counterplan to do if you wanted to break away from Europe and wanted to kind of look more towards Asia. I think South Korea could be it for you.
All right, the last section, we're going to go over some generic Ks. There's going to be 4 that I talk about. The first is the security critique. And basically the theory of this is security theory questions the ways that we talk about risks, threats, disasters, and existential impacts. It criticizes scare tactics, fear mongering, and argues that security discussions, when they utilize these scare tactics or when they talk about existential risks, in a particular way, that they create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So they create the scenarios that they're trying to avoid. And so the links here is the affirmative just focuses on security as the goal of cooperation, but they justify it based on preventing existential threats, which paint all other NATO countries as threats and also paint that particular situation in a way that's securitized. And the impacts here is the self-fulfilling prophecy, so you could read it as a case turn. You could also say it makes war, conflict, or things like anxiety inevitable. The next one is your generic Cap K. Capitalism's a set of economic theories and systems that place trade and industry in the hands of private entities rather than the state and its citizens. The links here would say that the affirmative uses NATO, and NATO inherently exists to protect US economic interests and globalization. NATO is also filled with anti-communist sentiment, which we talked about when we talked about how NATO was built. And that's anti-communism plays into the hands of private entities, but that's directly contrasted with the really strong role of the state and with things, ideological systems like socialism. They also view technological innovation through lenses of profit, NATO specifically. So all of those are potential link areas that the negative could be reading. And your impacts here are capitalism causes war or makes climate change inevitable. You can also read something like CAP makes, global South worse, dispossession, things like that. So your CAP K can also be a case turn depending on what their impacts are, or you could go to an external impact like climate change, war, etc. The next one is the cybernetics K. This theory is a little bit complicated, but basically what it says is modern technology is changing the way that we communicate, understand, and empathize with people, and it's making us more automated and less genuine. And so the links here are going to be links to things like AI or cyber, and they're going to say that focusing on emerging technology is as replacing or more valuable than humans, especially if you think about AI, reduces us to a set of data points. And essentially the impact to that is it destroys value to life. So it's a little bit of a different type of K, but you are going to see it, especially if you're reading kind of an AI AF. The last one is international relations critiques. So these are kind of a broad category. They're going to be your critiques of things like realism, liberalism, or international relations. So some might say that realism and rational choice theories are wrong because states are not atomized and instead are very cooperative, or things like the prisoner's dilemma, which realism was built off of, is like a false. So another version of this might say that IR, it relies on a bunch of heteronormative and hierarchical tropes of masculinity, and that those conceptualizations get materialized into conflict, which is how they get into impacts. And that's going to be your fem IR or your queer IR critiques. So obviously this is a really big topic, but don't get overwhelmed. We're here to help you, and you'll also get way more familiar with the topic as the season progressed. But until then, thank y'all for listening.